Thanks, guys. There are certain people that whenever they speak on certain topics, everybody sits up and listens. For example, if Jack Nicklaus says something about golf or Nick Saban says something about football, you can rest assured that their words will not only be reported on, but will probably appear somewhere on the front page of the sports section, if not the front page of the paper itself. Same thing is true whenever Steven Spielberg talks about making movies, John Grisham talks about writing books, or Dolly Parton comments on the music industry. You can rest assured if they say something publicly, it's going to be retweeted, published, pinned, and it's going to appear everywhere in just a few seconds. In the business world, and in particular in the world of investing, there's one man whose voice seems to draw the most attention. I've got a picture I want to show you of him. His name is Warren Buffett, and that's him on the left. He's been the CEO of a holding company called Berkshire Hathaway since 1965, and today he's the sixth wealthiest person on earth. His net worth is somewhere around $103 billion. And because of his incredible success, there are literally millions of people that hang on his every word, hoping to gain some insight into how he's been so successful, or maybe hoping to learn the secret to his success. Back at the end of 2020, he was invited to speak at a virtual commencement ceremony, graduation ceremony, for the University of Nebraska, which is where his parents went to school and where they met. So it's kind of a cool deal for him. If you've ever been to one of those, you know how it goes. The speaker normally just passes along some advice that they think might be helpful to whoever's graduating. That's what Warren Buffett did. The only difference this time was, because of who he is, every major newspaper was covering his speech to see if he said anything that would be newsworthy. Near the beginning of his speech, he summarized his investment philosophy with these words. He said, "Rule number 1 is never lose money. Rule number 2 is never forget rule number 1. Now, if it really was that easy, everybody would be doing it, but we're not, so there has to be more to it than that. But then later in his speech, he said a couple things that did get a lot of attention. One is something he said a lot over the years when he said, the most important investment you can make is in yourself. And he talked about the importance of continuing your education, continuing to read, continuing to polish your skills, because that'll be what sets you apart in the future. Then a few minutes later, he made this statement. He said, the key to long-term success is to multiply yourself through other people. Now, the reason that got a lot of attention is that 3 months later, in February of 2021, 90-year-old Warren Buffett and the other guy you see in this picture, his 95-year-old business partner, Charlie Munger, made an announcement that it's time for them to start thinking about a transition to the next generation of leaders. In a follow-up interview with the New York Times, they both made it clear, though, that they have no plans on retiring in the short term, but they're at least starting the process of thinking about a long-term transition. Now, when you're 90 and 95, I don't know how you define short-term and long-term, but they made it clear that they're at least thinking about a long-term transition. But I do know that they've hit on something that's important, not only in the business world, but especially when it comes to advancing God's kingdom. And it might surprise you to know that Warren Buffett is not the first person to say this. In fact, he's not even the most famous person to ever say this. It was said long before he was ever thought of. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to 2 Timothy chapter 2. This morning, we're concluding our series, Musical Chairs, and all along we've said, spiritually speaking, every single person is sitting in one of these 4 chairs. You're either a seeker, a follower, a servant, or a leader. We're going to put them on the screen just so everybody can see them together. And one of the things we've talked about as we go through this is that there is a declining number of people in each of these seats. There have always been more seekers than followers. In the church, there have always been more followers than servants. And it's when you get to this last level, the level of leadership, that the ranks really begin to thin out. And I don't have any idea what the actual percentage would be, but I do know that most of us don't see ourselves as leaders in God's kingdom. If you're like me, you hear that word leader and you have this image that pops in your mind of somebody standing up in front of a group of people and barking orders, or maybe you think about a leader as somebody that, develops plans and makes decisions and inspires the people around them. And if that's your vision of leadership, it's no wonder that most of us don't see ourselves that way. That's why you get this last level, and there's a very small number of people who would raise their hand and say, you know what, I am a leader in God's kingdom. But maybe the reason there's not more of us that would admit to that is because we've misdefined the word leader. A better way to think of a leader is that a leader is someone who influences other people. I like the way John Maxwell puts this. He said, leadership is influence, nothing more and nothing less. And here's the cool part about this. No matter what your situation, everybody here has some level of influence. There are people that you influence on a regular basis that you may not even realize you're doing it. You have kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews and co-workers and neighbors and teammates and people in your core group. There's just all kinds of people that you have influence over at whatever level it is, and you may not even realize it. So the question is, which direction are you leading in? If there are people looking to me to influence them, which direction am I leading them? So this morning, as we talk about this last chair, I want you to know that you've been called to be a leader. You may have never thought about it like that, but it's true. If you're a follower of Jesus, you've been called to use whatever level of influence you have, whether it's a lot or a little, to help encourage people to become followers of Jesus and servants of Jesus and leaders in advancing God's kingdom in their own right. And the good news is that the Bible actually gives us a strategy for how to do this. So what you have in 2 Timothy chapter 2 is part of a letter written by a guy named Paul, who was even more famous and has had more impact on the world than even Warren Buffett. And the reason this letter is so important, it's the last thing that Paul ever wrote. He addresses it to a man named Timothy, who has been like a son to him through the latter part of his life. And now Paul has come to a point in his life where he's on death row in a Roman prison. He knows that at any moment the prison doors are going to swing open, the soldiers are going to come in, and they're going to take him off, and he's going to face his death. And it's while he's in this Roman prison that Timothy, his son in the faith, is literally 5,000 miles away in a place called Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey, and he's trying to lead a church. So they can't be together during what will be the final days of Paul's life, but Paul writes this letter to pass on some important things to Timothy. Paul knows that the key to long-term success is to multiply your efforts through other people, and that's really what this letter is about. He's trying to pass on to Timothy some things that he wants Timothy to pass on to other people, who will then in the future go on and pass these things on to even more people. And Paul understood a principle that somehow we've forgotten. See, whenever we think about advancing God's kingdom, most of us think in terms of addition, right? We want to add more people. We want to have a bigger church. We want to build bigger buildings. We want to add even more people after that. And hopefully at the end of all that, we'll impact the community around us in a greater way. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's not necessarily bad. In fact, there are a lot of good things that come with addition. It's just that when you read the New Testament, you discover that there's something even better than addition, and that's multiplication. According to Paul, the goal of advancing God's kingdom has always been about multiplication. Rather than just attracting followers, our mission as a New Testament church is to train leaders who can then go out and train even more leaders. Now, addition is good, but multiplication is a lot better, because it's through multiplication that you really start to have an outsized impact on the people around us. If you were here last weekend, we looked at this story, Luke chapter 10. Jesus is getting ready to travel into the area called Judea. And before he goes, he gets this little group of 72, and he sends them out. So you think, why would Jesus do that? I mean, you got a group of 72 people. There's going to be some disappointments in their group. There's going to be some all-stars. There's going to be some people who really get it, and some people who leave you wondering, what were they thinking? So why would Jesus, who was perfectly capable of going to Judea and doing all kinds of incredible stuff on his own and accomplishing some miraculous things, why would he take the time to identify and train and then follow up with this group of 72? Why does he do that? He does it because Jesus knows that multiplication is better than addition. He's going to multiply his efforts through this little group of 72, and then they'll continue to carry it on throughout their lives, and all of a sudden, he'll reach more and more and more people. When you get to 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul gives us a strategy for how to do the exact same thing in our day-to-day lives. And the good news is it's not nearly as complicated as we sometimes try to make it. All right, there are 4 parts of the strategy that Paul lays out. If you're keeping track, here's the first one. As you try to lead others, you have to make sure first and foremost that you're leading by example. Now, there's a really important progression as you look at the way Paul lays this out. Before he encourages Timothy to invest in other people, he first challenges Timothy to make sure that he's strong in the faith himself. Check out the way he does this in verse 1. You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. As you read through some of Paul's other letters in the New Testament, you'll find this was something that was never very far away from his mind. He knew that before you can lead other people, you first have to lead yourself. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says it like this. He says, therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and I make it my slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Then 2 chapters later, 1 Corinthians 11, he says this. He says, follow my example as I follow Christ. But notice the progression. Before I can invite anybody to follow me, I've got to make sure that I'm disciplining myself and that I'm following Jesus in the way that I need to. It's something that Paul was obsessed with as you read through his letters. And the question is, why was he so obsessed with it? And he was obsessed with it because Paul understood the principle that what people need are not just teachers, they need models. They need people they can look to that will show them how this is supposed to work. What people need from you and what people need from me is not just good advice. They need good examples. Now, most of us are pretty good at giving advice. We may not be very good at setting the example. And what was true in the first century is even more true in the 21st century. What the people around us need most from us is not for us to stand on the corner and yell louder and point more fingers. What they need from us is to model a different way of life that more closely aligns with who Jesus has called us to be and what he's called us to do. I have another picture I want to show you. Unlike the first 2 guys, I actually know these 2 guys. Some of you recognize the guy on the right. His name is Bob Russell. He's been here several times, preached at Southeast Christian in Louisville for 40 years. When he started, they ran about 120. When he retired, they were averaging over 20,000 every weekend. The other man that you see in the picture is Ben Merrill, longtime preacher out in California, had a huge church out there. He retired at the age of 65, moved to Illinois, and took sort of a part-time gig at a little church running about 75, and he thought this would be a good way to slow down. 25 years later, they were averaging over 3,000, and he retired a second time at the age of 89. Every Sunday night, Bob sends out a blog, and some of you read it, and last Sunday night, this picture was a part of his blog. It was a tribute to Ben Merrill. Ben was somebody that he's looked to over the last few years, and now Ben is 95 years old, and Bob talked about how he's still out there preaching every weekend. I mean, every weekend he's traveling all over the country at 95 years old. And then he made this statement that you see on the screen. He said, all Christians need a mentor like Paul to instruct them, a friend like Barnabas to encourage them, and a student like Timothy to incentivize them. And from there he went on. He talked about how for the last really 4 or 5 decades of his life, Ben Merrill has been like the Apostle Paul for him. Somebody that's instructed him, somebody that's continued to encourage him. Then he closed it by saying this. He said, if I live to be 95 years old, I want to be as gracious, engaged, and selfless as Ben Merrill. Now, Bob Russell's nearing 80 years old, and he's looking to somebody in the previous generation as his model. And then at the end, he said this, if I die at 95, I want Ben Merrill to preach my funeral. And I don't know if it'll work out that way, but let me ask you a question. Who is it that inspires you to be better than you are? Who is it that you look to as a model for what this is supposed to look like? Let me ask you this way. Who is it that looks to you? I mean, when your kids and your grandkids look at you, what do they get? Do they get good advice, or do they see a good example? Because there's a difference. I mean, all of us are pretty good at giving advice. We're not so good at setting an example. One person said it like this: people may listen to what you say, but they watch what you do. So you have to make sure that you're leading the people you influence by example and not just by talking. Now here's the second thing. As you seek to multiply the kingdom, you have to intentionally invest in key people. Verse 2 is kind of the key verse, this whole passage. Paul writes, "And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." And every once in a while, you'll see these articles, and they'll go back and they'll identify certain investments. And they'll say, hey, if you had invested a certain amount at this certain time, then today, you would have some crazy amount of money. I read one just this week, said if you had invested $1,000 in Amazon back in the year 2000, then today that same investment would be worth nearly $50,000. Or if you had bought $1,000 worth of stock in Netflix in 2002, today your initial investment would be worth nearly $422,000. Here's the one that killed me, though. I almost literally passed out. If you had invested $1,000 in Zoom on January 1st of 2020, then today that investment would be worth $5,655. I literally almost fell out of my chair. If you've had any Zoom meetings, you know what I'm talking about. But what normally happens at the end of the articles is they say, here's what you need to invest in now, because here's what's going to be the next big thing. And they go through and they're trying to sell you something. Now keep in mind, they don't really know. They don't know what's going to hit. They don't know what's going to miss, but they're trying to sell you something. They know that everybody deep down inside is looking for that surefire thing that's guaranteed to bring you a return on your investment. Well, in verse 2, Paul identifies the one investment that you can make that's guaranteed to bring you a return. And it has nothing to do with the stock market, the banking industry, cryptocurrency, the tech industry. Has nothing to do with any of that. Instead, it has everything to do with people. And what Paul's describing in verse 2 is what we call 4-generation discipling. It started with Paul, gets handed down to Timothy. Timothy hands it off to reliable people. And in the future, those reliable people entrust it to others. That's how it's supposed to work. It's one generation reaching the next generation. And that Greek word that Paul uses for entrust literally means to make a deposit. That's what Paul's been doing. He has spent his life making deposits in the lives of other people. He calls it fanning the flame, because he knows that the key to long-term success is for him to multiply his efforts through Timothy and a lot of other people just like him. But here's the problem with that. What those articles that I mentioned earlier never tell you is they never go back and identify the investments you could have made where you would have lost all your money. Right? I mean, there are companies that you could have invested in years ago that have since gone bankrupt, or something happened and their value plummeted. And if you had invested in those companies instead of these others, you would have lost most of your money. So I was thinking about that, and I thought, you know what? That's a pretty good picture of what most of us do. Most of us spend our lives making bad investments. We chase things that are incredibly temporary. So we spend our lives chasing this job, and we get the job, and we spend all of our time focused on the job. And then one day we retire, and 3 days after we leave, everybody forgets that we ever worked there. Or you spend your life chasing and building up this huge bank account. And then you die, and you leave it to somebody else who may or may not appreciate it and may or may not squander it. Or you spend your life chasing trophies, chasing certain possessions, and then you get them, and you realize it's not what you thought it was. If you want to invest your life in something that's going to outlive your life, you have to invest your life in people. So I want to ask you a question. If I handed you a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, and I said, I just want you to make some lines, and and you write down the names of the people that you know you're influencing, the people that you're leading to become better versions of themselves, to become closer to who God created them to be, whose names would you write down? And I don't want you to write down the names of people you wish you were influencing, but the people that you're actually influencing. So if you're a parent or a grandparent, that should be fairly easy. You should be able to write down the names of your kids and your grandkids. If you're serving in a position in the church, you ought to be able to write down the names of the people that you're training to one day take your place. I mean, there ought to be a list, but if you can't write anybody down, if you could honestly, if there's not one name you could write down, then it's important that you go back and you rethink what it means to actually be a follower of Jesus, and especially to be a leader. Now, the third step in this strategy is that you have to, at some point, you have to eliminate the distractions. Do you know why some people couldn't write down any names? Do you know why most of us never really get around to investing in the lives of the people around us? Most of the time, it's because we're so distracted with all the other stuff we've got going on. We got bills to pay and projects to finish and phone calls to return and ball games to attend and trips to take and shows to watch and places to go and people to see, and on it goes. And so what happens is we fill our days and then we fill our lives with all of these different things, and they might even be good things. I mean, they might be things that positively contribute to our community, but they're not the best things. And see, you can miss out on the best things because you're distracted with good things. That's why when you get to verse 3, Paul uses this series of analogies to sort of describe the kind of effort this takes. Look at what he says. He says, "Join with me in suffering, like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. Similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all." What do soldiers, athletes, and farmers all have in common? Focus, determination, and consistency. If you're a soldier and you're in the middle of a battle and you lose focus, the odds are pretty good you're going to get killed. And you might even get some people around you killed. If you're an athlete, you decide to be inconsistent in your play or lose focus in the middle of a game, you're not going to win the game. If you're a farmer and you decide you're going to just hang out instead of cultivating your crop, the harvest is not going to be what you want it to be. So let me ask you, do you think it's possible that the reason we don't see much happening in terms of multiplication, you think it's possible that the reason you've not led anybody to Jesus in the last year, or maybe the last 10 years, or maybe ever, is because you're so distracted with a lot of good things that you never get around to doing the best things? In his commencement speech at Nebraska, Warren Buffett made another comment I thought was so good. He said, "The difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything." Let's say it again. The difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. See, here's the deal. If I know that I've got a limited amount of time, then I've got to disentangle myself from some things so that I can give myself to the best things. That's why really successful people say no to almost everything. They don't want to get entangled in things that are going to pull them away from the primary thing. Now, this last part, part 4 of this 4-part strategy, is as you engage in this process, you have to learn to endure joyfully. One of the things that can happen when you read this, you get so caught up in the details of what Paul has said that you lose sight of where he was. I said earlier, Paul, as he writes this letter, is literally inside of a prison cell in Rome. He knows that within just a few moments, maybe even a few seconds, the guards are going to come down the hallway and he's going to hear their footsteps and they're going to come. They're going to unlock that prison door. They're going to take him by the arm. They're going to lead him out and they're going to put him on a place called the pavement where his head will literally be removed from his body. in just a few seconds. And yet when you read this, no fear, no bitterness, no angst. Look at the way he ends this in verse 8. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel for which I'm suffering, even to the point of being chained like a criminal. But God's word is not chained. Therefore, I endure everything for the sake of the elect, that they too may obtain the salvation that is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory. Here is a trustworthy saying: if we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will disown us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Put yourself in that prison cell with Paul, literally waiting for the moment that he would die and enter into what he called the eternal glory. And he knows that because Jesus Christ was resurrected from the dead, that he himself will be resurrected from the dead. And it's not because of anything he did. Rather, it's because of what Jesus did on his behalf. That's the story of the gospel. That's why it's called good news. And Paul gets to the end of his life, and he is so consumed with thoughts of his eternal destination that he encourages Timothy. He says, hey, whether things are good or bad, whether they respond or don't respond, whether the door's open or whether the door's closed, whether you're in prison or whether you're preaching out in public, you remember Jesus Christ raised from the dead. Because when you remember him, you'll be able to endure whatever life throws at you without losing your joy. This past Wednesday, it was getting late in the afternoon, and I was working on this message down in my office, and I decided to flip on the news just to get some background noise. As soon as I turned on the television, it's on a news channel already, and I heard that familiar sound that everybody's used to, breaking news. So I turned around to see, and I know the definition of breaking news has changed over the last few years. Now everything's breaking news, right? I mean, they can tell you stuff that happened 3 days ago, and it's still breaking news, every detail. But I turned it on, and the story immediately was about Warren Buffett. So I got online, I read an article later, I took a screenshot of it just to share it with you. The news for the day was that he had donated $4 billion to the Gates Foundation, which is a nonprofit that he helped to found with Bill Gates several years ago. So they talked about this donation. In addition to the donation, he resigned from the board of directors from the Gates Foundation, which was big news in the business world. So they talk about all the details of that. Then they bring on a couple business analysts to explain why this is such a big deal. And then after a few minutes of that, they pointed to a statement that Warren Buffett had released upon the announcement that he resigned from this board. He talked about how in his later years now he's resigning from basically everything that's outside of his own company as a way of slowing down. And then at the end of the statement, he said this. I want you to listen close. Here's what he said. He said, these remarks are no swan song. I still relish being on the field and carrying the ball, but I'm clearly playing in a game that for me has moved past the fourth quarter and into overtime. Now from there they brought on these different analysts and they tried to predict what the ripple effects would be, that the great Warren Buffett has finally acknowledged that, hey, there could be an end in sight. And the more I thought about it, it occurred to me that what's true of Warren Buffett is really true of all of us. Paul said it like this a couple chapters later. He said, for I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is near. Now here's what I know. You don't have to be 90 years old, and you don't have to be on death row in a Roman prison to understand that the clock is already ticking. If you're a parent and you've got young kids at home, you need to know the clock is ticking. And your window of opportunity to really influence them in the right direction, man, that window is already closing. If you're an older person, who's closer to the end than you are the beginning. You already know the clock is ticking because you can feel it with every passing day. Or if you think you're somewhere in the middle, you think, well, I kind of get that, but hey, I've still got a long time left to go. Here's the deal. That may or may not be true because you don't know how much time is on the clock that's ticking. All you know is it's still ticking. And you may be a lot closer to the fourth quarter than you realize. Because that clock is relentlessly ticking. Now, here's what that means. If I know that the clock is ticking, that means I've got some decisions to make. And if you know that your clock is ticking, then you know that you've got some decisions to make. You have to decide, if I only have a limited amount of time, and I don't even really know how limited it is, how can I best use that time? What is it that I need to stop doing so that I can make time to start doing things that will outlive me? Or maybe a better question is, who is it that I need to pour myself into? Who is it that I need to lead to become a better version of themselves with the limited amount of time that I have left? For the last 4 weeks, we've been talking about these 4 chairs. And hopefully by now, you've been able to identify which chair you're in. You're either a seeker, a follower, a servant, or a leader. And as we close today, we'll move on to something else next week. I want to encourage you to move to that next chair, whatever it is for you. If you're a seeker, I want you to consider becoming a follower of Jesus. If you're already a follower of Jesus, I want you to make a commitment today that you're going to find a way to start serving Jesus. If you don't know how to do that, Austin's going to be out at Connection Point. I'll be here. David will be here. We love to talk with you. If you're already serving Jesus, you need to find a way to start leading other people to start serving Jesus. But I also know that for some of you here, the next step is really the first step. Because for whatever reason, you've never put your trust in Christ, you've never repented of your sin, you've never publicly confessed Him, you've never been baptized into Him. And if that's your situation, I want to ask you, do it today. And you may think, well, I've been thinking about it, but I got plenty of time. But the truth is, you may not. So if you've got questions, we'll try to answer them. If there's some special arrangements that need to be made, we'll make them. If there's something you're unsure of, we'll try to help you figure it out. We'll walk with you every step of the way. But as we sing this last song, I want you to know that clock is ticking. And I hope a year from now that we're all sitting here and we're doing this again. But the truth is, and you know this is true, between now and next year, the clock's going to run out for somebody. Could be you. Hope not. Could be me. Hope not. But the clock's ticking. I want you to stand. If you're here and you need to pray with somebody, you want to join the team, you want to talk to somebody, we'd love to have you. Imperfect church led by deeply imperfect people. But we'd love to help you get from wherever you are to wherever you think God needs you to be.